She was surrounded by wolves until the giant Apache stepped out of the trees and moved gradually towards the terrified girl. But soon she felt a sigh of relief when Apache arrived, and wolves fled. Eliza Moore froze mid-step when the birds went silent. That sudden, unnatural hush, snapping her attention sharper than fear ever could, because in the mountains, silence meant teeth-deciding distance. She didn't turn at first. She didn't run. She felt the wolves before she saw them, the pressure of eyes tightening the air, the cold snow under her boots turning treacherous as her breath fogged too fast. One gray shape slid into view between the trees, then another, then more, spaced deliberately, not circling wildly but arranging her, measuring her, patient in the way only predators were when they already believed time belonged to them. Eliza backed slowly to a pine, bark rough against her spine, lifting her hands the way her father once taught her. Palms open, body tall, because panic invited pursuit and stillness sometimes bought seconds. The wolves' ears were forward, tails low, their breath drifting white and steady, and she understood with a clarity that hollowed her chest that this was not a mistake encounter. It was a decision forming. Snow crunched softly as one stepped closer, testing, and Eliza counted heartbeats to keep herself present, whispering a prayer she didn't expect to finish because hope felt smaller when spoken out loud. Then something shifted. Not sound, but weight. The wolves hesitated as one, heads turning uphill, bodies stiffening, and Eliza felt the forest inhale, as if another presence had entered the equation without asking permission. She followed their gaze and saw him emerge from the trees, impossibly tall, broad-shouldered, moving with a calm that did not belong to rescue or rush, but certainty. He stepped into the open as if the forest had made room for him, dark hair tied back, eyes already reading the pack, not her, and the wolves reacted before she could. Spacing faltered, confidence thinning into calculation. He did not shout. He did not raise a weapon. He stood, feet planted, shoulders relaxed, claiming the ground without declaring it, and Eliza realized the animals were not afraid of him so much as uncertain, which was worse for a hunt. One wolf growled low, another shifted sideways, and the man lifted a single hand, not to threaten, but to mark the boundary where choice ended. The gesture carried weight, ancient and deliberate, and the forest seemed to hold it. Eliza's legs shook, cold and terror blurring together, and she realized she hadn't truly looked at his face yet, only at the way the wolves watched him. When she did, she saw something steadier than promise, a stillness that did not guarantee safety, but refused surrender. The man took one slow step forward, snow cracking loud in the silence, and the wolves faltered again, the circle loosening just enough to breathe, and Eliza understood in that suspended instant that this was not a man arriving in time by chance, but one who had chosen this exact moment to be seen. And whatever happened next would not be decided by fear, but by who held the ground when the forest finally exhaled. The wolves did not flee when Tall Bear stepped forward. They adjusted, the circle loosening into an oval that tested angles rather than retreat. And Eliza felt the difference immediately, because uncertainty could be as dangerous as hunger. Tall Bear moved again, not toward her but across her line of sight, placing his body between her and the nearest gray shape, with a precision that told her he had measured this distance long before she ever entered it, and the wolves read the movement the way animals did, not as threat but as intent. He bent slightly and scooped a handful of snow, packing it once, twice, then tossed it hard against a trunk behind the pack, the crack sharp enough to break their rhythm without inviting a charge. And the forest answered with a rustle that made the wolves hesitate again. Eliza kept her hands raised, breath slow now, watching his shoulders more than the animals, understanding that panic would pull his timing off if she let it, and she trusted him because he had not rushed her into trust. Tallbear spoke then, not loudly and not to her, a low Apache phrase carried on the cold air like instruction rather than command, and the sound settled the space as if the forest recognized it, the wolves' ears flicking as they recalculated what this hunt would cost. One of them stepped back, another followed, the movement subtle and staggered, and Tallbear took another step, angling his body to widen the gap without chasing it open, because pursuit turned retreat into challenge. He stopped again, letting stillness do the work, and Eliza felt the pressure ease just enough to feel her feet return to her body. The pack lingered, testing with their eyes, then broke their formation in pieces, rather than all at once, melting into trees that swallowed them without sound, leaving only breath and the soft tick of snow falling from branches. Eliza's knees buckled as the circle finally released, and Tallbear was there in a heartbeat, steadying her elbow without pulling her close, grounding her without claiming her, and she clung to the fact of him because it was solid and real and did not ask anything in return. He guided her to a fallen log and crouched nearby, scanning the tree line until he was satisfied the forest had finished its decision. Then he turned his attention to her for the first time, eyes sharp but not intrusive, noting the way her fingers shook and the frost biting through her boots. He asked her name simply, as if it mattered more than explanation, and when she told him he nodded once, acknowledging something beyond the syllables. Tallbear pointed downslope, where the trees thinned, and said there was shelter not far, his voice even, leaving the choice open in the way that mattered most after fear. And Eliza understood that the ground he had claimed was not just the place where the wolves stopped, but the space where she was allowed to decide what happened next. They moved downslope at a measured pace, Tallbear setting the line without hurrying it, choosing ground that held and let sound fall away. And Eliza matched him, step for step, discovering that fear loosened when it was given something practical to do. The forest still watched them, not with the focus it had given the hunt, but with the ordinary attention of a place that noticed movement, and Tallbear kept his eyes traveling, counting spaces, reading where branches thinned and snow lay less crusted, making decisions before they asked to be noticed. Eliza's breath steadied as the trees opened, the rhythm of walking pulling her back into herself, and she realized how close she had been to dissolving into panic, how quickly that would have made her small again, and the understanding stiffened her spine more than warmth ever could. Tallbear spoke once, quietly, telling her to place her feet where he had placed his, not as order, but as invitation, and she followed because trust had been earned without being demanded. The shelter revealed itself as a shallow rock fold cupped by cedar, old and honest, the kind that existed whether people used it or not, and Tallbear guided her inside and set a small fire with movements so economical they felt like memory rather than choice. Heat returned in increments, and with it sensation, ache, sting, the sharp return of fingers, and Eliza welcomed it because pain meant she was still present. Tallbear checked the tree line again before turning fully toward her, his height folding down as he crouched, eyes level, assessing without prying, and he asked if she was injured in a way that would worsen with cold. She told him about the fall, the long walk, the misstep that had slowed her, and he listened without interrupting, weighing what mattered and leaving the rest untouched. He wrapped her ankle with cloth torn from his own sleeve, the gesture practical and unremarkable, and Eliza felt the steadiness of it settle her more than any reassurance could have. Outside, the forest resumed its ordinary sounds, wind in needles, snow shedding from limbs, and Tallbear said the wolves would not return today, not because they were frightened, but because the cost had changed, and Eliza understood the truth in that. the way danger retreated when it was forced to account for itself. She asked then why he had been there, why he had chosen that ridge at that hour, and Tall Bear answered that he followed sign and weather, and sometimes that brought him to places where decisions waited, the words landing as explanation without apology. As the fire burned low and the shelter held, Eliza felt something new take shape. Not safety guaranteed, but the possibility of it, grounded in movement and choice rather than rescue. And when Tall Bear stood and pointed again towards the thinning trees, saying they would move before light shifted and tracks hardened, she rose without hesitation, understanding that the path ahead did not belong to fear anymore, and that whatever waited beyond the next stand of trees would be met with the same calm that had broken the circle and opened a way forward. They left the shelter before the fire could draw attention, Tall Bear brushing snow across the embers with the heel of his boot until heat vanished into steam, because survival depended on knowing when warmth became signal. The forest thinned as they moved, trunks widening their spaces, light cutting through in clean bands that sharpened edges and flattened shadows. And Eliza felt the tension ease another notch as the ground stopped closing around her. Tall Bear set a steady pace that honored her injury without letting it define them, angling toward a low saddle where wind scoured tracks thin and scent carried poorly, choices made long before fear could argue for easier ground. As they walked, Eliza noticed how he paused without stopping, small checks that read the land without announcing concern, and she matched them instinctively, learning the grammar of movement that kept trouble from forming. A distant howl lifted once and fell away, unanswered, and Tall Bear did not turn, knowing the sound marked presence rather than pursuit, the forest settling into its ordinary conversations. At the saddle he halted and let Eliza stand beside him, not behind, the view opening into a shallow basin with timber at the edges and open snow between, a place honest enough to speak in daylight. And he told her they would cross quickly and rest again, only after they reached the far trees. Halfway across, Eliza's ankle faltered, and she caught herself, breath hitching, and Tall Bear was there without hurry, shoulder offered, weight shared without comment, the moment passing cleanly because it had not been dramatized. On the far side, he checked the wind and nodded once, satisfaction brief, then guided her into the trees where cedar broke the cold and the ground rose gently, protection that felt earned rather than borrowed. He asked then where she had been headed before the forest chose otherwise, and Eliza told him of the trading road, the winter work promised and delayed, the long walk that had become longer than planned, and Tall Bear listened with the same attention he gave the land, separating what mattered from what could wait. When they reached a narrow stream rimmed with ice, he knelt to break a channel and let water run, then waited while she drank, eyes on the tree line, and Eliza felt the steadiness of being protected without being watched. As the light shifted toward afternoon, Tall Bear said there was a camp ahead used by travelers when weather turned, neutral ground that belonged to effort rather than claim, and Eliza felt the truth of it settle because neutrality after danger felt like freedom. They moved on together. The forest no longer a ring, but a corridor, and Eliza understood that being released was not the same as being finished. It was the moment when fear stopped leading and choice took its place. And as Tall Bear set their course with quiet confidence, she knew whatever waited at the camp would be faced, not as prey rescued from the trees, but as a woman who had crossed a line and found her footing again in the open. The camp revealed itself by smoke that did not hurry, a thin thread rising straight in the cold air, and Tall Bear slowed them without stopping, letting Eliza see it before stepping fully into the open, because places earned trust the same way people did. It sat in a shallow bowl where wind skimmed the edges and left the center calm, a scatter of fire rings and packed snow that spoke of use without possession. and Eliza felt the shift immediately, the difference between ground that tested and ground that waited. Tallbear approached at an angle that showed his hands and his intent, voice low when he greeted the people there. And the answers came back unforced, curiosity measured rather than sharpened, the tone of those who had learned to listen before deciding. Eliza stood beside him without hiding, weight balanced, breath steady, and the choice mattered because it named her presence without asking permission for it. A woman rose and brought water without question. Another moved a log closer to the fire, and no one asked where Eliza had come from or why the forest had kept her so long. The restraint a kind of welcome that settled her nerves more than warmth alone. Tallbear checked her ankle with a glance and a nod, then stepped away to speak with a man tending gear, exchanging information about weather and tracks in the clipped language of those who traveled often. And Eliza realized the protection he offered did not depend on hovering. It depended on placing her where the work of belonging could begin. As the afternoon leaned on, she helped where she could, holding a kettle, mending a tear, learning the camp's quiet rules by observation rather than instruction, and the simple usefulness steadied her, turning survival into participation. A pair of riders passed on the far rim and did not slow, the smallest signal that danger had lost its appetite, and Tallbear noted it without comment, satisfied that the cost had changed enough to hold. When the light thinned and the fire burned low, Tallbear returned and told Eliza she could stay as long as she wished, not as shelter owed, but as space offered, and the phrasing mattered because it left her future intact. She thanked him once, simply, and he accepted it with a nod that ended the exchange before it could become debt, understanding that the circle had been broken not by dominance or noise, but by standing still until the forest, the wolves, and the people all agreed the ground had changed. Morning came without urgency, the camp waking into movement the way it always had, fire coaxed back to life, gear checked, plans spoken softly and revised without argument, and Eliza felt the unfamiliar ease of a place that did not measure her by what she had survived. Tallbear rose early and walked the perimeter once, reading tracks softened by night wind, satisfied that nothing curious had lingered. And when he returned, he handed Eliza a cup of warmed broth without ceremony, the kind of care that assumed recovery rather than dependence. She tested her ankle and found it steadier, pain present but no longer ruling her, and the improvement mattered because it returned agency in small, reliable pieces. As the day stretched, people asked her what she could do rather than what had happened, a shift that felt deliberate and kind, and Eliza answered honestly, discovering how quickly usefulness rebuilt confidence when it was invited instead of demanded. Tallbear did not stay close. He spoke with others, shared information about the weather turning again, and watched her only enough to notice when she moved without favoring the injury, the restraint signaling trust. By midday, a hunter returned with news of wolves farther north, moving on, their interest spent, and Eliza felt the last tightness in her chest loosen because fear lost its hold when it was given a direction away. She thanked Tallbear again, this time for the space rather than the rescue, and he answered that space was easier to give once the ground had been claimed, the words carrying a truth she would remember. When afternoon light angled low and the camp began to prepare for movement, Tallbear asked Eliza what she intended next, the question open and unweighted, and she realized it was the first time since the forest that her answer would belong entirely to her. Eliza did not answer Tallbear right away, not because she lacked direction, but because the question deserved the same care he had given the ground when he stepped into the trees, and she felt the weight of that respect settle before she spoke. She told him she would travel east with the next group until her ankle was strong enough to work again, then decide whether to stay on the road or set down somewhere that asked less of her name and more of her hands. And the plan sounded right because it did not borrow certainty. It hadn't earned yet. Tall Bear listened without interruption, eyes steady, and nodded once, accepting the shape of her choice without trying to improve it, the response confirming she had not mistaken the quiet authority he carried. The camp shifted around them as preparations continued, people packing, fires banked, routes discussed, and Eliza felt the comfort of motion that moved forward rather than circled back, the kind that turned survival into progress. When they broke camp, Tall Bear walked with her at the edge of the group, where conversation thinned and the forest opened, giving her space to test her footing and her resolve. And he pointed out the signs she would need to read when traveling alone again. Wind in the branches, snow that crusted before dusk, the way animals crossed water to lose attention. Knowledge offered without expectation of return. At a fork, where the timber gave way to rolling ground, he stopped and let the others move on ahead, the moment small but decisive, and Eliza understood it as the place where protection stepped back to let choice take the lead. She thanked him one last time, not with words shaped like gratitude, but with the steadiness of her stance and the certainty in her eyes, and Tall Bear inclined his head, satisfied that the circle had closed cleanly. As she turned east and followed the tracks ahead, Eliza felt the forest behind her settle into ordinary sound, and she carried with her not the memory of teeth or fear, but the knowledge that when danger closed without a sound, it could be met without noise as well, and that the ground you claimed with calm and patience could carry you far beyond the place where the circle first formed. By the second day of travel, Eliza felt the rhythm return to her body. Not the careless confidence she'd had before the forest closed around her, but something steadier, earned through attention and restraint, and the difference mattered because it lasted. The group moved with purpose but without hurry, stopping where wind scoured tracks thin and resting where sound traveled poorly, choices Tall Bear had modeled until they felt natural rather than learned. No one watched her ankle anymore. They noticed when she adjusted her pace and matched it without comment, the quiet accommodation telling her she was no longer being carried by circumstance. At midday, they crossed open ground where the trees fell back and the sky widened, and Eliza felt the strange relief of being visible without being vulnerable, the open space no longer an invitation to fear. She caught herself scanning the tree line out of habit and smiled at the reflex, understanding that vigilance did not vanish. It softened into awareness once danger passed. That evening, as they made camp near a bend in the river, Tall Bear kept his distance, speaking with others, letting her find her place among the tasks that needed doing. And Eliza realized how deliberately he had stepped back, trusting her to stand without the shadow that had first protected her. When night settled and the fire burned low, she listened to the ordinary sounds, water over stone, wind through grass, and felt the forest's earlier silence lose its edge, becoming just another memory carried without weight. She slept deeply for the first time since the wolves, and when she woke before dawn, the fear that had once snapped her awake did not return, replaced instead by the simple readiness to move when light came. As the group prepared to travel on, Eliza looked west once, not in longing but recognition, knowing the distance behind her was holding steady, not chasing, and that the ground ahead would be met with the same calm that had broken the circle and opened a way forward. As the days passed, the memory of the wolves lost its sharp edges and became something Eliza could carry without flinching. Not forgotten, but settled into its proper place. A lesson rather than a wound. Travel thinned the group as routes split and obligations called people away, and Eliza felt herself standing more often on her own feet, making small decisions that stitched confidence back together without ceremony. When they reached the trading road, busy with wagons and voices, She noticed how the noise no longer overwhelmed her, how crowds felt manageable now that silence had taught her its cost. Tall Bear stopped with her at the edge of the road and pointed out the way east, the bend where weather gathered late and the creek ran shallow, information offered plainly, then stepped back, already loosening his hold on the moment. She thanked him once more, quietly, and he answered with a nod that carried completion rather than farewell, the understanding that some encounters ended not because they failed, but because they had done their work. As she walked on alone, Eliza felt the absence of fear more clearly than the presence of safety. The space inside her no longer crowded by anticipation, and she realized the forest had not simply released her body, it had returned her judgment. Behind her, Tall Bear turned back toward the timberline, his path diverging without regret, the giant shape receding into trees that no longer felt threatening. And Eliza carried forward the calm he had modeled, knowing that what remained after the forest fell silent was not gratitude owed or debt unpaid, but the steady knowledge that danger could be met without surrender, and that choosing where to stand mattered long after the moment passed. By the time Eliza reached the first settlement east of the timberline, winter had softened just enough to let the road breathe, and she realized the fear she carried no longer leaned forward, no longer tried to decide her steps before she did. She found work the honest way, by showing what her hands could do and how steadily she did it. And when nights came quiet instead of sharp, she understood that survival had finished its work and left something stronger behind. People asked where she had learned to move the way she did, how she read weather and space without panic, and Eliza answered simply that the forest had taught her, leaving out the circle, the teeth, the moment when everything could have ended, because some lessons did not need their sharp edges retold. Weeks later, news traveled that wolves had been seen farther north, following the old paths again, and Eliza felt no tightening in her chest. Only awareness, the kind that acknowledged danger without letting it speak first. She walked the road with confidence now, not careless, but certain in the knowledge that fear did not own silence anymore. Far west, where the trees grew thick and the mountains held their own counsel, Tall Bear continued his patrols, stepping through forest and snow with the same measured calm, intervening only when ground demanded it, leaving no mark beyond the way danger recalculated and moved on. He did not speak of the woman he had pulled from the circle, not because the moment lacked meaning, but because meaning that endured did not require repetition. When spring finally touched the high ground and snow released its grip, the forest resumed its ordinary balance, predators and people keeping their distances, the memory of that day settling into the land like a line drawn and respected. Eliza stood one evening at the edge of the road, watching light fade without fear, and understood the story had ended exactly where it should, not with rescue claimed or lives bound, but with ground held long enough for choice to return. The wolves had tested, the forest had watched, and a man had stepped forward without noise. And because of that, the circle had broken and stayed broken, leaving behind not debt or promise, but a quiet certainty that when danger closed in again somewhere beyond sight, there would always be a place where someone chose to stand, and that knowledge, once earned, did not fade. If this story touched your spirit, share it so that the voices of the ancestors are never forgotten. Like and subscribe to Native American Tales, where every time we bring you another cinematic legend, where pain meets purpose,